Hello everyone and welcome back to The Discerning Gamer. Today is kind of an interesting video. I wanted to make a response to a video that Razzman made airing his concerns about some of the changes that have been made in Steel Division, particularly by comparison to Wargame, the last game that Eugen made. For context, Razzman is a veteran of the Wargame franchise, and someone who's even gone so far as to make a balance mod for Red Dragon. He's a very high level player and has competed in and hosted in tournaments, so he's definitely somebody who knows what he's talking about, particularly where Eugen strategy games are concerned. So while I do agree with some of the concerns that he raised in his videos, I do think that he didn't quite take into consideration some key factors that perhaps would influence other people's judgment, or perhaps even his own judgment, given second thoughts. So I wanted to make a kind of response video to his video, offering a different take on the points that he raises and kind of continuing the conversation. I will note before I go on that Razzman is a much more veteran Wargame player than I am, and definitely a more competent RTS player than me, as you'll probably see from the first-person VOD I've got running in the background. So that might give him some insight that I'm lacking. But from what I've played of Steel Division and what I understand of the game at launch, I think that there is definitely some potential for a long-term competitive scene that perhaps he hasn't given credit to in his video, so I wanted to cover that. Also, as another caveat, I've watched loads of Razzman's videos, and I am definitely not setting out to bash him or his opinions, just to offer a different take on the issue. And as I mentioned, I've got some VOD footage of a 1v1 I played earlier today to feast your eyes on while I'm rambling. So I'm going to run through the main points that Razzman made in his video. I will put a link to it down in the description if you'd like to hear it from him firsthand, in case I've got the wrong end of the stick on any of this. So Razzman's first point is that Steel Division is obviously trying to be a very authentic game, but perhaps that as a result of this, it hasn't taken enough liberties with either its unit or deck design in favour of making the game mechanically or competitively fun to play with. And that might have stripped out some of the longevity in terms of how long you're going to be able to draw enjoyment from the game before it sort of gets old, because all of the mechanics or possibilities of the game have kind of been exhausted by just playing it so much. And I think that's definitely something that is a danger with, or something to be concerned of with Eugen's games, shall we say, because obviously they are so deep and you can learn so much about the units and the strategy that generally when people play them, they want to kind of get quite invested in them over a longer period. So I see his point on this, and I agree that Steel Division definitely has a more limited focus. After all, it's only covering the divisions that took part specifically in the Normandy campaign in 1944, whereas Wargame has already been through 3 iterations and has basically carried over and added stuff in each of the sequels. Not to mention that, but the scope of the game covers nearly the entire planet in terms of the theatre of war, but also most of the major nations that you'd expect to compete in a conflict, and the timeline of it goes between 1960 and 1990, so that's a kind of 30-year window to play with, whereas we're playing with very specifically one geography and one time period in Steel Division. And what I would say is that this, in the long term, might prove to be a mistake for Eugen, because they've cultivated a fan base of people who are really used to having a huge variety to go with in their games. But I actually think that narrowing the focus of the game down has allowed it to perhaps deliver more on a mechanical level and perhaps a more pure mechanical experience. And I'll go on to kind of explain what I mean by this when I address some of Razzman's other points in just a moment. Needless to say, I think that the amount of depth and enjoyment that we're going to get out of the game is certainly going to keep us busy for 6 months, probably longer, to the point where we're actually going to be in a position for Eugen to be releasing more DLC, perhaps a structured expansion that takes us to a different theatre or something along those lines, which will allow them to add more to the package in the same way that they did with Wargame. Because let's not forget, we're talking about a game there that had, you know, years and years to get to where it actually is in Red Dragon as we see it now. So the second major point that Razzman made was that deck building has become more simple in Steel Division because of the limitations of having a very focused division rather than the arsenal of an entire nation to pick from. He makes the point that decks kind of build themselves because you're always going to need a certain amount of units in each phase to be competitive. And that also there's no way to adjust the availability of units like you could in Wargame Red Dragon, where, for example, you could say, all right, well, this is now a mechanized division or a motorized division or an airborne division, and it would change what you could take in all the different categories. Steel Division doesn't allow you to do this, and as a result, Razzman kind of makes the point that perhaps it is going to force you into playing each division a certain way. Now, I can see where Razzman is coming from on this point. The divisions do have a more narrow focus than the national decks that we saw in Wargame. However, I feel that it's really too early to say whether decks will build themselves and what you can get away with in terms of taking different things at different points in the game. Though we're using a smaller pool of units, I think that the phase system will make a huge difference into how this actually plays out on the battlefield. Perhaps with more experimentation, competitive players will find that certain divisions are able to survive on a shoestring of units in Phase A as long as they play very efficiently, and that then allows them to bank loads of points and explode out of the gates in Phase B or Phase C with a deck that's built primarily of the units for that phase. And then obviously you've got the whole dynamic of being able to punish the other player for taking a lot of cards in Phase A that they haven't taken advantage of enough, that they've beaten us out of the game, and now because we have focused on Phase B or Phase C, we can suddenly leverage a huge advantage on them. And I feel like Razzman perhaps didn't give this element of the deck building or the game enough attention and to how that would allow us to vary decks over the coming months when we're kind of much more familiar with what units can do what or fit in where. Because of the more focused nature of each division, I find that actually they end up playing a lot more differently than they would in Wargame. So of course you can make focused decks in Wargame. However, because of the nature of that game, you have to have a response to pretty much most things that the enemy can throw at you. For example, you're always going to struggle if you don't take a super heavy tank, or if you don't have some form of very reliable radar AA or something along those lines. Whereas I feel like in Steel Division, because of the nature of each division you're playing against, they are naturally going to have much more pronounced weaknesses and much more varied play styles. For example, when I was playing the US Armoured, though their infantry is very good, when I was playing them, I found that there's a real potential for you to actually run out of infantry during the later half of the game, and suddenly you have to play completely differently because you have to rely solely on tanks. Likewise, when you're playing an infantry division, you don't really have access to a large amount of armor or even very good armor early in the game. So you suddenly have to play much more in a style where you pivot around anti-tank guns, and that just provides a much more different play style than you would see in Wargame, where no matter what, you're probably going to be able to take some sort of heavy tank, or you're going to have an ATGM to deal with something. Likewise, I think we also need to remember that from launch we're going to have 18 divisions to play with, and there's also, I suppose, the potential for them to do multi-division battle groups later on in the development of the game, which, you know, doesn't seem unreasonable, particularly from an authenticity point of view. If we compare the variety in decks that we're going to see because of these 18 divisions and the variety in playstyle of these divisions to what Wargame was like in its very first iteration, European Escalation, then I think that Steel Division is going to provide a lot more variety in terms of play style and replayability over a longer period. And obviously and I suppose this is also from a competitive point of view, because obviously there were, I think, 800 odd units in European Escalation, but we've got to remember in Wargame that a lot of these units, if we're playing as competitive players, just really aren't particularly viable unless you're kind of horsing around or playing in a very specific coordinated team fashion. Razzman also goes on to make the point that the amount of units or variety that we see in the units is reduced because there aren't as many varieties of transport that we can take for each unit. And he also said that each division functions as an all-rounder, perhaps in the same way that Wargame did, because they, you know, regardless if it's an infantry division, like for example the Scots that I'm playing in the footage behind, they have access to decent tanks like the Challenger, and they are going to be able to get hold of some sort of planes or AA that are probably alright. So he kind of feels that you're going to have decks that have a core of 70% units that you're always going to see, and there'll be kind of a 30% variability depending on how you want to play them, which is not as big as what we'd see in Wargame. So I agree that we are going to see the same sorts of units popping up more frequently in Steel Division, because, you know, the template for the game, the basis of the game, is going to be realistic combat divisions that actually used the best equipment available and would use what was available to them just in 1944 rather than the 30-year period that we have access to in Wargame. However, I think that decks in Steel Division will end up playing way differently in the actual game because you physically can't cover all of your bases. Like, for example, if I'm playing as an infantry division, I have no armoured transports for the vast majority of my troops, so it forces me to play radically differently. Whereas, as I've said before, in Wargame, you're kind of able to cover all of your bases, and also, you know, based on the meta and the balance for that particular patch, you're always going to be forced into taking a certain core sort of unit most of the time. Like, for example, you're going to usually want a super heavy tank and some decent radar AA and an air superiority fighter, something along those lines. So another point that Razzman made was that unit stats are more homogeneous in Steel Division. So generally you're going to see every unit having one of 3 different range stats, a much less variety in terms of armor penetration, rate of fire, armor, that sort of thing. And also we're not seeing different types of weapon systems, like for example anti-tank guided missiles. Tanks don't have auto loaders, and so he kind of feels that tanks are just reduced down to basically their AP and their armor, and that as a result decks are having less variety and are kind of dumbed down to make them easier to build and where it's more immediately obvious what you need to take. I will agree with this to a certain extent as well, and it's kind of unavoidable because of the limited focus of the game. However, I also think it's kind of a good thing, and it is something that I've criticised Wargame on previously. This is going to be much easier for newer players to get into and be competitive in than compared to Wargame. And that is, when we're talking about the longevity of a competitive scene, that is really important, because if you don't constantly have new people to play against and fresh blood, you end up with the kind of lobby matchmaking simulator that you often had to play in Wargame, and also a kind of stagnant base where new players were crushed by more experienced players and never kind of had intermediate opponents to fight against to introduce them to playing the game at a higher level in a way that perhaps wasn't so frustrating because they were constantly fighting against veteran players. And though the lack of variety will limit some of the choices and decisions and deck building possibilities, I feel like that it won't necessarily hurt the longevity of the game overall, because we have brand new mechanics in Steel Division, such as the phase system that I was talking about earlier, that allow you to experiment with how your force will be composed at different stages of the game. But also, I don't think Razzman took into account things like veterancy. So veterancy now has a much more dramatic effect on how units perform than it did in Wargame. If your troops are better trained, suddenly you have a lower availability of them, but you don't need to take as many leader units, so you can spend your points on a broader variety of units perhaps. Also, we've got the mechanic of combat stress. So previously in Wargame, if you didn't have a high enough armor penetration on your ATGM to deal with a tank, then that you couldn't kill it, and it could roll into your units and with a small amount of good micro dominate you. Whereas now, because of the way the combat stress system is modelled in Wargame, in Steel Division, there are much more nuanced ways of dealing with units. For example, say you're fighting against a Tiger tank, but you don't have access to, because of the way you've composed your deck, you don't have access to a anti-tank gun or tank that is able to reliably penetrate it. What you could do is set a trap with it with a Boffer's anti-tank gun and call in a Spitfire and some light artillery to all fire at it at the same time. That's going to fill up its stress bar pretty quickly and neutralize it so it's forced to back up. So although you haven't actually killed the Tiger, you have stopped it from playing the role that your opponent wanted it to on the battlefield. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of replayability, because it's a quite a deep and more nuanced mechanic that will allow players to find new and interesting ways to play, even if it is with a more limited variety of units. So Razzman went on to speak about the maps and how he feels that they're much more homogenous than they were in Wargame. And I would say on the surface that I can kind of see where he's coming through on this. He looked specifically at Columbell in its 3v3, I think, 3v3 configuration, where it's at its widest. And he made the point that there was basically very wide open fields in the middle that would just be dominated by tanks, where infantry has no role to play. And because we don't have big forests and tanks can't go into forests, that there was less camouflage and it became more of kind of an open slugfest and made for less interesting gameplay. So I don't necessarily agree with this, really, because obviously we're focused on the theatre of Normandy, and in Normandy, instead of having large forests or very hilly terrain, we have the bocage. And when we look at the other map that we have available in the beta to play at the moment, which is Pont du Hoc, that is suddenly very different, because rather than having the large open spaces like we see in the middle of Columbell, we have sightline almost perpetually broken every 200 or 300 meters because of the bocage. So suddenly, in certain places where you can get them a sightline down a road or through a particularly large field, tanks are very useful. But in amongst all the areas of the bocage, then infantry have a much larger role to play with their shorter range anti-tank weapons that can actually reach out and touch tanks if they venture into that kind of maze situation. I would in fact argue that the way that the bocage works and the way it breaks sightline and the micro it's going to require to fight effectively within it, I think that that's actually going to be a lot more micro intensive and make for more interesting play than we would see with the forests and hilltops in Wargame, because they are, quite obvious and simple obstacles compared to a big maze of hedgerows, and also because the scale of Steel Division is at a smaller level. We can go down and micro in between buildings and in between hedgerows, and forests are much larger features on the map. Suddenly that makes a much more of a difference than it would in something like Wargame, where forests are just kind of big blobs of trees and towns have to be divided up into more simple sectors because of the scale that the game operates at. So another point that Razzman made was that because infantry anti-tank capability is really limited, basically to 250 meters, control of towns and towns as a feature of the map mean much less. They really don't provide very good cover for AT guns. They are a maze for AT guns to go through. They don't provide camouflage like forests do, and you can't dig in an AT gun or put it in a building to give it cover in the same way that you could with an ATGM or something in Wargame. So the sort of total of the effect on this is that the towns and built-up areas exude a much smaller area of control and can kind of be ignored by tanks, taking away quite a lot from the infantry side of the game. And I actually quite strongly agree with this point. I think towns can give you quite a large piece of map control in terms of affecting the front line. And any deck that doesn't bring something along to help control them is going to suffer. But in terms of the point efficacy of fighting through towns, it's much reduced in the current state of the game. And because of the way AT guns move in towns, they have really broken sight lines. They don't get any advantage for being in there, and also they're very slow to move from one side of the town to the other, whereas an ATGM in a town in Wargame could actually be very reactive and stop tanks or other vehicles from moving through that area and force the enemy to come and have a fight with you in that town, making it an actual important part of the map. So I think hopefully Eugen can do something to address this. Perhaps by making it so that AT guns get some sort of bonus for being in a town, or perhaps AT guns can work in sectors in towns in the same way that we saw in Wargame, so that if you have an AT gun in one sector of the town, it can relocate quickly and fire at things through a very wide arc from that side of the town, for example. I definitely think that needs some looking at in some way, because I don't think, even from an authenticity standpoint, I think that controlling a town in World War II did give you an advantage in terms of halting an enemy advance or making it somewhere that the enemy would have to deal with before they could move through or encircle you, for example. And the last point that I want to touch on that Razzman made was that you can't repair or reinforce units with logistics trucks, and the way that kind of strips out the skill of unit preservation in the game and is just kind of annoying. I totally agree with this, and I think that it's something that Eugen needs to implement, because it just takes all a large degree of the tension out of the game. If you've got a squad that runs away on one man in Wargame, you can bring up a Logi truck and get an entire squad back from that, as well as providing fuel and ammo or repairs to other units. And not to have that in this game just means that you end up with 3 or 4 men in one squad over here, 3 or 4 men in another, and they just become these kind of like nuisance units that are kind of expendable. You end up maybe running them across an open field to probe an enemy front line in a way that a commander from World War II just wouldn't want to do. And this point also transfers over to tanks, where effectively there's no difference between a tank that has taken 50 AT shells to its frontal armour and hasn't suffered a penetration, compared to a tank that is just rolled fresh into the field without suffering any combat damage at all. And obviously that's kind of BS, isn't it? That's, armour is just because something bounces off it doesn't mean it hasn't suffered some sort of hit to its structural integrity or some sort of flaw somewhere. So I think that needs to be modelled in the game to some respect, because it will add another layer to tank micro and add another kind of decision that you can make when controlling your tanks, rather than it just being this kind of yes or no, is it dead, is it alive state. So broadly, I agree with what Razzman was saying, that the scope of deck composition has been limited in Steel Division compared to Wargame. However, I don't think it's as straightforward as Razzman initially asserts, and I don't think that he gave enough credit to the depth of the mechanics and the changes that have been brought mechanically into Steel Division. We may have lost things like autoloaders, anti-tank guided missiles, radar AA, and seed planes, but I would argue that we've gained much more nuanced mechanics in the form of combat stress, where I'm able to play out different strategies, render enemy units ineffective by hitting them with a wider variety of units, or by cutting them off from their front line or something like that. We've also got the leadership system, where perhaps I could take more numerous cheap infantry like the Luftlander's Ersatztruppen, and I can buff them up to an acceptable level by having a commander there. However, then my opponent kind of has this task of having to snipe the commander unit to then turn that cheaper infantry into the garbage it would otherwise be without that good commander. And of course the phase system adds a whole new factor to how we deploy these smaller sets of units and how we set up our game plan and micro and things like that. And I just don't think perhaps Razzman gave it quite enough credit to what an effect it would have on the game in the long term, in terms of actually providing it with a good shelf life and making it into a game that we're going to want to play for hundreds of hours, in the same way that we did with each of the entries of the Wargame franchise. And also I think that it's worth looking at kind of the business factors or context that Steel Division is coming out with. So it's the first game that Eugen have made in partnership with Paradox, and what do we know about the way Paradox likes to develop games? They like to make a tentpole game, really invest in that, cultivate a very dedicated and loyal player base, and then exploit that in inverted commas. Not that it's a bad thing, but to sell them more DLC and really flesh that experience out for them. So I think that that Eugen and Paradox are going to be invested in us playing this game for hundreds of hours and getting a lot of mileage out of it in that respect. Anyway, I'm really interested to know where you guys land on this matter, particularly for players who didn't play Wargame and for veterans of the series alike. Do you buy my arguments, or do you stand more firm with Razzman? Let me know in the credits, and do drop us a like if you've enjoyed the video. If you haven't, obviously some constructive criticism would be greatly appreciated, because I am trying to improve and grow the channel. So that's really all I wanted to say for this video. Thank you for watching so far, guys. I hope it's been sort of reasonably well structured and not too rambly. There's quite a while of the game to run so far, and I did record some of my commentary as I was playing through it, so I'll just let that run with my live commentary, and hopefully that'll be of some value to you guys. So before I let that roll on, if you guys did enjoy this and would like to see more Steel Division content and other games broadly, but also some more strategy game content from things like Dawn of War 3, do subscribe, because I will be uploading regularly, and I will be stepping up the pace in the coming months as well, to provide multiple videos per week as well. I've been the Discerning Gamer. Until next time. That's Spitfire effective.
Company. Get out now! Receiving loud. What's up, Captain?
Look at this poor one bastard having to... Oh, there's two of them. Interesting.
Go, gentlemen. Beware
Just
of
thinking that
Huns.
poor bugger having to drag a 17-pounder on his own. Nice.
Waiting for orders. Awaiting instructions. Germans ahead. Radio check, red 1-6, over. Yes, sir.
Can't grow all the distance over. Maybe if I bring in a Wolverine, might help.
Stay on your guards, gentlemen. Wilco, out.
Evacuate that Spitfire. I mean, this is... I haven't really been... Ooh, it's Command Stewart. That was lucky to withstand a Panzerfaust.
Roger, advance and engage.
Arguably kind of worth it. Look at that 17-pounder. You don't fuck with that.
Roger. Redeploying. We can get some fire support, sir.
Go on, one Piat guy, run away. Let's get some artillery.
Fire for effect. Good luck, gentlemen. I hear you, over.
Blow this fucker away instantly. Come on. Show me the explosion, AVRE. Aligning, aiming. They're pinned. Yeah, they've managed to get away somehow.
What are your orders, sir?
Oh my god, the Piat team got out of there alive. That's crazy. Let's see if we can get the rifle leader.
Time to lead from the front. Successful hit.
Come on, Piat. Do the work. Ooh, holy mother of... What was that?
Ready for trophy hunting.
What's the range? 1200 meters. That's good.
Red 6 mounted up. Back
That's
up,
okay.
back up, back up.
Yeah.
Ready, sir. Just get out of here.
Why are they... Yeah, see that falling back. I mean, falling back towards... I suppose they're falling into the front line, maybe. Panther G. That's a pain in the ass. I'm going to call another Wolverine in over here. Yeah, the fullback IAI could definitely use a bit of work.
Let's go, Lieutenant. Go back, driver.
Oh, come on, Churchill's alright. I mean, I should win fairly soon, but come on.
Ready for trophy hunting. Wilco, out.
See if I can...
To all units. Enemy sighted. Drop 200. 6 rounds. Fire for effect. Waiting for orders. One more hit and we're done. Sir, we're moving, lads.
It's quite a heavy battery, let's try that. And the Crusader. That looks pretty good as well.
Spotted. Prepare for firing. Attention! Move and watch your flanks. Waiting for fire coordinates.
And the Chalet. That'd be quite a good idea to get one of them out. Oh. Unfortunately, that's been reduced to a burning
Everybody,
Hulk.
check your ammo. This is a story you'll tell your grandchildren.
Ready to brew some tanks, sir? Roger. 20 degrees left. Fire!
Please kill that Panzer G. Bounced.
Looking for prey. Move and stay alert. Going there.
Bounce.
I spot movements. Prepare to engage. Ready, sir.
Get down!
Never was so much owed by so many to so few.
Ready to brew some tanks, sir?
Come on, surely the Wolverine and the 17 pounder have got to penetrate here. Okay, he's falling back.
Kameraden, das war's. Sir, going there.
What kind of firepower can I call in here?
Yes, sir.
Come on. Penetrating the front arm line of Panther is in tall
Setting up,
order, isn't
sir.
it?
Checking ammos, sir.
Fire and maneuver.
Velvet 1,
Get out of
ready.
there, Spitfire.
Radio check, red 1-6, over.
Let's try a fire for effect on either here.
Request fire mission. Green 734-536.
Let's hope Jerry won't catch us in the open. Tommy's ready for battle.
Fire. Smash them.
Platoon formed and ready.
Just at a distance.
Let's
Just
go and watch out.
creeping up to there. What tanks have I got left? The Churchill. Bring him in and support. Bring in a little dingo to support them.
Yes, sir. We'll be as discreet as possible.
Stay on your guards, gentlemen.
Come on, Piet. Looks like a good kind of side armor shot here.
Yes, sir.
Do the work. Do the work. Oh.
Anti-tank team, operational, sir.
Transmission damage falling back. Well, there it is. Good game. That was a pretty tidy one. He didn't play to the strength of his division there, and that was his problem. Even though, I mean, you know, his units are fairly strong. Even though I was in a commanding position, he still made me pay for it relatively. I didn't trade that effectively. Just have a look through this here so I can pause later and maybe have a look. Yeah, the AVRE versus the Panzergrens absolutely annihilates them. Good.